From the very moment you are listening to these words, there is something happening quietly in the background that you can probably feel yourself. A door in history that has never been opened is slowly turning on its hinges. This is not about dry textbook pages, but about the story of a people whose destiny was written from the earliest days of humanity. There are secrets hidden in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis that most of the world has brushed aside, and it is exactly that neglect that has kept them from ever understanding why Iran, a name that constantly stirs controversy in modern headlines, was already being shaped long before any empire even existed. If you truly want to know why this nation keeps showing up in the middle of conflicts, why its influence reaches far beyond its borders, and why its role in prophecy makes the world so cautious, then keep walking with me. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is a sacred blueprint that was laid down long before humanity even understood what role it was playing. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained. Let us go back to the dawn of the world after the Great Flood, when the ground was still soft and the rivers had not yet settled into their final paths. People at that time did not carry crowns or march with armies. All they had were three family branches: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From them, the streams of nations flowed in many different directions and shaped the map of humanity. But among the countless names, there were two names that stayed quiet, never loud or celebrated, yet carried a historic weight that no one expected. Madai, a descendant of Japheth, settled in the rugged northern mountains of what is now Iran, where rock and stone forged people into fierce warriors. Elam, son of Shem, chose the fertile lands in the south, where oars dipped into the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. These two bloodlines, one from the harsh northern heights and one from the rich southern plains, were the very first seeds of the land the world today calls Iran. The strange thing is that even though they appeared so quietly, God did not leave them off his map of history. Genesis chapter 14 tells the story of the first international war ever recorded, and incredibly, Elam stands at the center of a four-king alliance from the east that attacks Canaan. This was not a small local disturbance. It was a large-scale military campaign. Cities were swept clean, people were taken as slaves, and among those dragged away was Lot, the nephew of Abraham. But then something impossible happened. With only 318 men, Abraham defeated the powerful Eastern coalition, rescued Lot, and shook the awareness of the whole region. It was not because he had some secret military genius. The story was written to remind humanity that no power is ever stronger than the plan of God. No matter how mighty an empire becomes, if it lifts its hand against those whom God protects, in the end, it will kneel before an outcome that no one can fully explain. After that defeat, Elam did not disappear. Madai was not forgotten. They continued to grow through generation after generation and family after family. Scattered communities slowly became tribes, and tribes grew into early forms of political power. In the blend between the tough mountain people of Madai and the wealthy lowland people of Elam, a new strength was forming that no one in that era could really see. Those quiet steps laid the groundwork for the Persian Empire, an empire that would one day terrify Assyria, bring Babylon crashing down, and become a bridge that connects the opening chapters and the closing chapters of sacred history. And this is only the beginning. When you realize that from the very first pages of the Bible, God placed a marker for a nation that would walk through all the ages, from the beginning right up to the end, you begin to understand that the story of Iran is not just about politics, oil, or religion. It is a story of destiny. A destiny that was written before history itself began, and that will only close when the final prophecy comes into view. If you want to continue exploring the 1,000-year journey of Persia in God's plan and understand why this nation holds a unique role throughout the entire Bible, make sure you subscribe to the channel to support us. That support gives Prophetic History Explained the motivation to create the next episodes that are already waiting for you ahead. From lands that did not yet have names on the ancient world's map, the tribes of Madai and the descendants of Elam slowly grew stronger in silence. No one knew that the union between them would create one of the most decisive empires in the plan of God. While other nations were fighting over small strips of territory, occasionally breaking out into conflicts that did not change much between two opposite landscapes, the northern high mountains and the fertile southern plains, a new power was quietly taking shape. At first, it was just scattered groups of people. Over time, they entered an era of tribal alliances and then became an increasingly clear political entity, Media and Persia. What makes this story extraordinary is not simply the birth of an empire, but the fact that God spoke about their role long before they reached their peak. When the Persians were still living in simple tents, when no one had yet been called their king, God spoke through the prophet Isaiah with a bold prophecy. There would be a foreign ruler not yet born, not yet written into any royal genealogy, who would be personally chosen by God to overthrow Babylon and open the way for Israel to return home. His name was Cyrus. To the Jewish people at that time, that name meant nothing. But in history, Cyrus became living proof that every era moves to the rhythm of an unseen hand. Jeremiah also saw ahead of time the steps Persia would take, but his words were double-edged like a sword with two sides. On one side, God would use them as a rod to strike Babylon, the empire that had burned the temple and carried Israel away into exile. On the other side, Elam itself, one branch of Persia's ancient roots, would be shattered because of pride and rebellion. However, the most surprising part appears at the very end of that prophecy. Elam would be restored in the last days. The message is very clear. God does not only judge, He also restores, and the people He chooses to use do not depend on whether they are considered a covenant people in human eyes. When Babylon's empire stood at the very peak of its power, no one in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar imagined that its downfall had already begun inside its own palace. A young Jewish exile named Daniel received visions that would later become the prophetic roadmap for the entire history of the Middle East. In those visions, Persia did not appear as a political idea, but as a part of a sacred plan. Daniel saw a giant statue in which the chest and two arms made of silver represented the kingdom of Media and Persia that would come after the golden head of Babylon. He saw a bear raised up on one side holding 3 portions of plunder in its mouth, foreshadowing 3 great conquests of Persia. Then he saw a ram with 2 horns charging wherever it chose, unstoppable, until it was struck down by a goat coming from the west, a picture of Alexander the Great. These images were not just forecasts. They were declarations that Persia would hold center stage in completing some of the most critical phases of Israel's history. Every victory, every defeat, every turning point of Persia had already been assigned its place. If Babylon represents the arrogance of humanity, then Persia stands as proof that God can use any nation, even a nation outside the covenant, to accomplish His will. What is even more remarkable is that the rise of Persia did not come from simple political ambition. It came from a long preparation across many generations. A mountain people like Madai, used to hardship, provided the future empire with endurance and toughness. A people like Elam, overflowing with resources, contributed wealth, skills, and an ideal geographical location. When the two became one, they were not just the rival of Babylon. They became the hammer that God used to break the pride of the strongest empire of that time. As if to stamp their role even deeper, Daniel, the man who saw the future in his sleep, lived right inside the royal palace where he watched political tensions twisting and tightening every day. Every time he interpreted a dream for a Babylonian king, he saw even more clearly that the jewel of power was not in the hands of the ruler, but in the hands of the one who had arranged all of history. All of this leads to one unavoidable conclusion. Persia did not rise because they were stronger than other nations. They appeared at the exact moment they were needed because God had chosen them for a task that no one else could carry. And as that empire began to expand its territory, every door of power opened not only because of military strength, but because they were walking on a road that had been written long before. This second part of the story is not only about an empire. It reminds us that every upheaval in the world has its own name in God's sacred arrangement, and Persia is one of the clearest and most brilliant examples of that truth. When the strength of Babylon still seemed unshakable, a name was rising on the horizon that would soon become an echo feared across the entire Near East: Cyrus. Not every king carries the mark of prophecy, but with Cyrus, his very presence feels like God's answer to 70 years of desperate prayers from an exiled people. If in the previous part we saw Persia being prepared as a sacred instrument, then now, at the moment Cyrus steps onto the stage of history, the entire picture that the prophets once saw begins to come into focus more clearly than ever. Cyrus grew up among peoples who were used to war and hardship. What set him apart was not only his military talent, but his ability to see what others ignored. While many rulers focused only on guarding their borders, Cyrus understood that for an empire to truly last, it had to be built on the unity of nations that had once been strangers to one another. That is why the first thing he did was not to expand his borders, but to unite the tribes of Media and Persia, who had lived side by side but had never shared a common destiny. Once that foundation was in place, the doors of history swung open before him. Meanwhile, in Babylon, the atmosphere of luxury and pride was thick with complacency. The empire that once made Israel tremble was now drowning in parties that flaunted its power. One of those very feasts became the sign of its downfall. On the night when Belshazzar raised a cup made from the holy objects looted from the temple in Jerusalem, human arrogance hit its final limit. That was also the night when a mysterious hand wrote on the wall words that only Daniel, the man who had already seen Persia rise, could interpret. The Babylonian kingdom had been weighed, judged, and handed over. Cyrus did not take Babylon by reckless force. He took it with rare wisdom. He did not smash its massive walls. Instead, he did what no one expected. He diverted the waters of the Euphrates River so that the riverbed dropped low and his army could quietly enter the city through the gates beneath the walls. While the Babylonians were still sleeping off their long feast, their empire had changed owners without them even realizing it. That was not just a military victory. It was the moment when prophecies that had stretched across centuries suddenly turned into living history. Yet what makes Cyrus such a unique figure in the Bible is not his conquest, but the act that had never been seen before. He freed a nation that did not belong to him. When he issued the decree that allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, the very house of worship that Babylon had destroyed, he did more than rewrite the religious history of Israel. He showed a reverence for the God of Israel that very few foreign rulers had ever shown. That act became a turning point that proves real power is not about holding territory, but about fulfilling a mission that was written long before a person even understands how they are being used. The protection that Persia offered Israel did not end with Cyrus. When the next royal dynasty set its capital in Susa, a story that seemed small but carried heavy destiny unfolded. Esther, a young Jewish orphan who grew up in silence, was brought into the palace among hundreds of other young women. No one knew her true background. No one imagined that someone like Esther could change the fate of her entire people. In the corridors of that Persian palace, thick with schemes, Haman, an ambitious official, nurtured a blind hatred. What began as anger toward one man who refused to bow to him turned into a plan to wipe out the entire Jewish people. This was no longer a personal grudge. It was a threat of genocide. And Esther, who had never planned to stand on the line between life and death, was suddenly the only one who could stop it. When she walked into the king's presence without being summoned, she knew that it could be the last moment of her life. Yet that act of courage opened the way to save the whole nation of Israel. In that decisive moment, Persia was no longer just an oppressive empire or an army of conquest. Persia became a shield. It became the country through which God's protection was shown most clearly. That event stands as powerful evidence that no matter where Israel is, God can use anyone, even a foreign empire, to protect his people. This part of the story shows us that in history there are sacred moments when God places people exactly where they need to be. Cyrus became the one who opened the way for Israel's restoration. Esther became the one who halted evil as it was spreading. And the Persian Empire, even while it looked like any other worldly superpower, became the instrument that carried both the justice and the mercy of God. For centuries after Cyrus, Esther, and the great upheavals of the Persian Empire had passed, it seemed as if Persia's role in sacred history had come to an end. The mighty empire that once shook the Middle East faded into the background, making way for Greece and then Rome. Yet it was in that seemingly quiet period that one of the most wondrous moments in the Bible unexpectedly bears the fingerprints of Persia, as if God was still watching that land and still using it in the most decisive hours. This was no longer the era of wars or thunderous oracles. It was a moment as gentle as a star in the night sky, yet powerful enough to turn the story of salvation. Before Jesus let out his first cry, while Bethlehem lay under the darkness of a winter night and no one realized that a world-changing event had just occurred, far to the east, a group of scholars who understood astronomy and calendars were quietly watching the heavens. They were not kings, and they were not Jewish priests. They were people known as Magi, a special class of intellectuals in eastern courts, known more in Persia than anywhere else. From the time of Daniel, when he served in the court of the Babylonian king and then under the Persians, knowledge of mysteries, the stars, and prophecy had been handed down from one generation to the next. No one knows exactly how much of Daniel's teaching they preserved, but there is one thing that is very likely. They were not strangers to the idea of a promised king, the Messiah of Israel. To understand why these wise men recognized the coming of the Savior, we have to look at Daniel's role. When he interpreted dreams for the kings of Babylon and Persia, he was not known only as a decoder of secrets. He became the head of the wise men of the East. You could say Daniel laid the foundation for a scholarly tradition that lasted for centuries. In Daniel chapter 9, he calculated the timing of the Messiah's arrival with such accuracy that researchers today are still amazed. Those numbers and those prophecies most likely remained stored in Persian libraries among scrolls and clay tablets passed down across generations. So when a strange star appeared, brighter than anything they had ever seen, the wise men did not look at it only with the eyes of astronomers. They looked at it with the memory of ancient prophecies. Daniel's records of timing and heavenly signs came together like a divine invitation. The understanding they held did not belong only to them. It was part of the long sacred journey that God had started centuries earlier. Their journey was not easy. From Persia to Judea is a distance of thousands of miles, which is thousands of kilometers, across deserts and through hostile territories. No one risks such a journey out of simple scientific curiosity. Only one thing makes a person leave safety and embrace danger. It is the deep conviction that they are pursuing something sacred. When they arrived in Jerusalem, they did not ask for a philosopher or a religious teacher. They asked one single question: Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? In that question, they declared something that even the people of Jerusalem had not yet grasped. That child was a king in the fullest sense of the word. Eventually, they reached Bethlehem, where the star stopped as if a guiding hand had come to rest. They stepped into a simple room where a baby lay in a manger. There was no throne, no palace, and no soldiers. Yet they immediately knelt. This was an act that ancient Persians who lived in a culture that deeply respected authority would never perform unless they stood before a power far above any earthly king. Then they presented 3 gifts, each one a prophecy in itself: gold for a king, frankincense for God, myrrh for the one who would die for humanity. That moment became the meeting point of 2 worlds: the promise to Israel and the recognition from the nations. It is astonishing that the first people outside Israel who understood this came from the very land that had once rescued them from exile, and that same land would appear again in the final prophecies. In a very real way, Persia shows up in all 3 great movements of sacred history: in the rescue, in the worship of the Savior, and in the storms of the end times. This part of the story shows us something deep. People often think that a nation has lost its role, that it has faded from the main storyline of history. But in God's plan, no silence is meaningless. Persia did not just enter the Bible through war or politics. Persia entered through worship, through recognition, through eyes that looked up at the sky and noticed a sign that others ignored. That is what makes them one of the most unique witnesses of the plan of salvation. They came from the farthest distance, understood the deepest truth, and bowed down the earliest. As the footsteps of empire after empire echoed across the earth, it seemed as though Persia's story had long passed with the age of ancient kings. But the Bible never closes the book on that land. After the pages that speak of Cyrus, Esther, and the wise men, Persia appears once more, not as a rescuer or a worshiper, but in a dramatic prophetic scene where the fate of nations is drawn by the hand of God Himself. This is no longer a story of conquests or everyday politics. This is the final act where human history reaches its hottest point, and again Persia stands in the center just as it has done for thousands of years. The prophet Ezekiel, who lived during the exile, was given a vision that has made generations shudder. He saw an alliance of nations coming like a storm from the north, sweeping down like a cloud that covers the land of Israel. In the list of those nations, one name is spoken directly with no symbolism and no subtlety: Persia. This is the same land that once opened the way for the Jews to return home. Now Persia is listed side by side with Gog, Magog, Cush, Put, Gomer, and Togarma, names that many scholars connect with areas that today are associated with Russia, Turkey, and North Africa. The presence of Persia in that alliance is not a small detail. It is a sign that the long-announced moment is approaching. Ezekiel describes that invasion as something unlike any war in history. It does not begin with declarations or follow normal strategies. It is like a violent storm that crashes in so fast, so wide, and so fierce that Israel appears to have no hope. But the purpose of that war is not to test human armies. It is to reveal the glory of God at the very moment when He intervenes directly. The images Ezekiel records are filled with supernatural force. Earthquakes that break apart mountains and hills. Fire from heaven that falls on the invading armies. Chaos so intense that allies turn on one another. No human king wins this battle, only God. Persia, the nation that once stood for Israel in one of the most important turning points in its history, now stands in a coalition under judgment. This makes the story complex and full of tension, but it also reflects the real nature of sacred history. Nations do not stay in the same position forever. Sometimes they are instruments of rescue. Sometimes they become enemies. Sometimes they become living examples of God's justice. However, what makes this picture truly extraordinary is not the judgment, but what comes after it. In the book of Jeremiah, God's words to Elam, one of the ancient foundations of Persia, have both light and shadow. On one side, God declares that he will break the bow of Elam, shattering its military strength and power. Immediately after that, there is a sentence that makes the reader pause. God says he will restore Elam in the last days. This is not a vague comfort. It is a confirmation that even when Persia steps into the darkest chapter of its history, God still keeps a door open for its return. That is what turns Iran's story into one of the most complete theological arcs in the Bible. It is created, used, honored, judged, and in the end, still carries a promise of restoration. When we look at the modern world, it is not hard to see that Iran, the descendant of ancient Persia, keeps appearing at the center of political and religious turmoil. This naturally makes many people ask, could it be that what Ezekiel saw is slowly taking shape? Is Iran stepping into a role that history gave it thousands of years ago? That question is not easy to answer, but biblical history always reminds us that every major event carries traces of something sacred. One thing is certain: God did not accidentally place Persia in both the opening and the closing parts of humanity's story. If a nation appears in Genesis, in the prophetic books, in the story of redemption, and then again in the final prophecies, its role is never merely geopolitical. It is destiny. And that destiny is still open, not closed, because the promise of restoration for Elam still stands like a sacred ellipsis at the end of the story. This final part reminds us that history is not a random chain of events. It is a grand symphony in which nations step into notes that were written beforehand. Persia is simply one of the strongest resonances. As the story moves into the last days, Persia, in its own way, still holds a special position. It is a warning. It is a promise. It is a witness that God's justice and mercy always walk side by side, even for nations that have stood on both sides of sacred history. When we apply this to our lives today, every listener can ask a personal question. What is my role in the larger story that God is writing? Is there something in my past that makes me believe that I have been disqualified from His plan? Persia tells us that this is not the truth. No matter how dark the circumstances may be, no matter how far a person has drifted from the right path, God can still use that very person to write the next chapter of a much larger journey. If you want to keep discovering the hidden stories in the Bible, the civilizations that seemed minor but actually carry crucial roles in prophecy and sacred history, then join the Prophetic History Explained community. You will receive more deep insights about biblical history, mysteries, prophecy, and the secrets that are slowly being revealed in our time. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so that we have more motivation to create the next episodes for you.